All right, let's jump into our deep dive today. And, tariffs are something we hear about all the time these days, right? We're going to try to really get to the bottom of how these taxes on imported goods, those tariffs, could actually end up hitting your wallet directly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We're going to be looking at how these global trade policies, how do they connect to the prices that you and I see every day at the grocery store or when we're out shopping for a car?
Makes sense. The source material that we're going to be using today is an excerpt from this article called The Economic Toll: How Tariffs on Mexico, China, and Canada Will Impact Americans. It takes a close look at President Trump's decision to impose tariffs on a whole bunch of goods from these three countries, which is interesting
That's
because,
a pretty big deal.
yeah, and the big deal is that
They were the top three U.S. trading partners?
they are the top three U.S. trading partners.
Exactly. So we could be talking about, affecting over 40% of all U.S. imports, just from last year.
Wow. Okay, so let's break this whole thing down. First, we'll look at food. Now, Mexico and Canada, they are major sources of food for the U.S. Did you know that in 2023, the U.S. spent over $3 billion on avocados from Mexico alone?
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, they're really crucial suppliers, especially for all the fresh produce that we love.
Mm-hmm.
And, grocery retailers, they generally operate on these super thin margins. So there's not really a lot of wiggle room for them to just absorb the cost of these tariffs, right?
Yeah.
So it's really likely that the cost is going to get passed on to us, the consumers.
So basically what you're saying is get ready for higher grocery bills, everyone.
Pretty much, yeah.
And it's not like we're just speculating here, right? Target CEO has actually already warned that fruit and vegetable prices could rise within days of these tariffs taking effect.
Oh, absolutely. And, another factor to keep in mind is climate change, right? So because of all the shifting weather patterns and stuff, the U.S. has actually become more reliant on imports,
Yeah.
particularly from Mexico, because it's affecting what we can actually produce here.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. So it looks like those avocado toast brunches that everybody loves, those are about to get a lot more expensive. But let's move beyond the produce aisle for a second and think about all those electronics and toys and appliances we buy. China is a major supplier for all that stuff, right?
Oh, totally. The numbers are kind of wild, actually. Did you know that something like 99% of shoes that are sold in the U.S. are imported?
Wow.
Yeah, and over half of those come from China. Same thing goes for 75% of the imported toys and sporting goods that are sold here.
That's mind-blowing. I never realized it was that much. So basically, let's say you're out shopping for a new smartphone, or you need to buy a soccer ball for your kid, or, you've had your eye on a fancy new coffee maker. Tariffs could make all those things more expensive. So how does that work? How do tariffs actually make things more expensive?
Well, it's basically a chain reaction. So tariffs will increase costs for manufacturers first, then it goes to the retailers, and then eventually, that increase trickles all the way down to us, the shoppers. And, economists have a fancy term for this. It's called cost push inflation.
I've heard that term before, yeah. All right, so we've covered food, we've talked about electronics, everyday items. Let's talk about something that is a big purchase for a lot of people: cars. What about the impact on the auto industry?
Oh, yeah. The auto industry is really fascinating because it shows just how interwoven trade is in North America. To build a modern car today involves parts crossing borders multiple times, all throughout the manufacturing process.
Such a complicated system, right? Like a giant puzzle.
Yeah,
So you're saying there's probably not a single car on the market today that wouldn't be affected by these tariffs?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. The Anderson Economic Group, they did this study, and they estimated that these tariffs could add something between $3,500 to $12,000 to the cost of actually producing a car in North America.
Wow, that's a huge jump. So what does that actually mean for people buying cars? I mean, could we see higher prices, production slowdowns, maybe even job losses?
All very possible, yeah. We might even see some car models just discontinued altogether, if the manufacturers decide it just doesn't make financial sense anymore.
Interesting. I've heard some people say that these tariffs are a good thing because they'll bring manufacturing back to the U.S. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a complex issue. While it might sound good, on the surface, shifting production like that is massive. It takes a huge amount of time, tons of investment, and all this complicated planning. It's not something that's just going to happen overnight just because some tariffs get put in place.
So there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. I think we've covered a lot of ground already today: food, electronics, cars. It seems like these tariffs have the potential to have a huge impact.
Yeah, they really do. And honestly, what we've talked about so far probably just scratches the surface. The full impact of all these tariffs, it's still unfolding, but it's pretty clear that they have the potential to really affect consumers in a bunch of different ways.
Welcome back to our deep dive on tariffs. Last time we saw how they could potentially affect everything from that grocery bill to how much you pay for a new car.
It's true, but there's always more to the story, right? It seems like all these different countries are constantly jockeying for position on this massive global chessboard, making these strategic moves to try and protect their own interests.
Exactly, and it's fascinating to watch it play out.
But what are the arguments for and against actually using tariffs as a strategy?
That is a great question, and it's one that has sparked a ton of debate. So on one side, you have people who say that tariffs are absolutely necessary to protect American jobs and industries. They argue that without tariffs, all these cheaper imports would just flood the market, putting American companies out of business and leading to all these job losses.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But isn't there another side to this argument?
Oh, absolutely. There are a lot of folks who say that tariffs actually end up hurting consumers in the long run. Their argument is that tariffs lead to higher prices for everyone, they limit choices for consumers, and they can even stifle innovation.
So it's kind of like a tug of war then, right? Between protecting domestic interests and keeping prices affordable for the average consumer.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely not always a black and white issue. There are valid points to be made on both sides.
Makes me think back to those avocados we were talking about earlier, if tariffs make those Mexican avocados more expensive, people might just end up buying fewer avocados, which could really hurt those Mexican farmers, right? But at the same time, those higher prices might encourage some people to buy avocados that are grown in the U.S., which would end up supporting American farmers.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how complex this whole issue can be. And it's not just limited to avocados. You see this kind of dynamic playing out in tons of different industries.
So true. What about those electronics and cars we talked about? How would this whole thing play out there?
Well, let's take smartphones, for example. If you put tariffs on Chinese-made smartphones, it might help to protect American tech companies and potentially lead to more jobs here in the U.S.
Yeah.
But those same tariffs would also make smartphones more expensive for consumers. And then some people might not be able to afford, the latest technology.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
And with cars, those higher production costs that we talked about could force manufacturers to do things like raise prices or cut back on how many cars they're making. That could lead to fewer choices for consumers and potentially even job losses in the auto industry.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's kind of a delicate balancing act, isn't it?
It really is.
Speaking of balancing acts, isn't there a risk that putting up all these tariffs could actually trigger retaliation from other countries?
Oh, there's definitely a risk of that.
Yeah.
When one country starts imposing tariffs, other countries often respond by imposing their own tariffs, usually targeting completely different industries.
So instead of a chess match, it turns into an all-out trade war.
Pretty much, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And trade wars can have some seriously far-reaching consequences for everyone involved.
Right. Historically, haven't trade wars led to things much higher prices and slower economic growth and even political instability in some cases?
That's right. One of the most famous examples is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act back in 1930. It was supposed to protect American farmers and businesses during the Great Depression. But a lot of economists now think that it actually made the Depression even worse because it triggered all this retaliation from other countries, which then led to a huge decline in global trade.
Wow, so history shows us that these tariffs can sometimes backfire pretty badly, leading to all these unintended consequences.
Exactly. It's definitely a reminder that we need to be really cautious and strategic when it comes to using tariffs.
Okay, so we've talked about the arguments for and against tariffs. We've talked about the potential for retaliation. We've even looked at some historical examples. So where does all this leave us? What can we do as everyday people to navigate this crazy landscape?
That's a fantastic question, and it's something I think a lot of people are struggling with right now. The first step is to just stay informed, pay attention to what's going on in the news, and really try to understand the different perspectives on all these different trade issues.
So instead of just skimming the headlines, we should really be digging in and trying to understand all the nuances of what's happening out there.
Exactly, yeah. Don't just accept things at face value,
Mm-hmm.
Challenge your own assumptions and try to seek out different viewpoints.
That's great advice. And what about those times when things get really confusing? When economists start throwing around all that jargon, what are we supposed to do then?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. There are so many resources out there that can help people understand all these complex economic concepts, Like, look for articles and videos and podcasts that explain things in a really clear and concise way.
Yeah, I like that. Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about these things, the better equipped we are to actually make good decisions.
100%. And, don't underestimate the power of your own voice either. Like, reach out to your elected officials and let them know what you're thinking, what your concerns are.
That's such a good point. I think we often forget that we actually have a say in these matters, right? Like our representatives need to hear from us so that they understand how all these policies are affecting their constituents.
Yeah, exactly. Let's make sure our voices are heard because ultimately this is about our wallets, our jobs, our communities.
Okay, so we've talked about staying informed, we've talked about making our voices heard. So what else can we do on a more individual level?
Another important step is to just be mindful of your own spending habits.
Yeah.
Like, think about where the products you buy are coming from and how tariffs might be affecting their prices.
Okay, so should we all become like obsessed with checking labels and researching the origins of everything in our shopping cart?
Uh-huh. Not necessarily obsessed, but it's definitely good to be aware. Maybe do a little extra research before you make a big purchase, especially if it's something that's likely to be impacted by these tariffs.
So like if I'm shopping for a new TV, I should maybe compare prices from different brands and see if some of them are manufactured in countries that aren't subject to all these tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. And think about supporting businesses that are committed to those fair trade practices.
That's a good point. By choosing to buy from companies that actually prioritize ethical and sustainable sourcing, we can send a message that we care about more than just the bottom line, right?
Exactly. And finally, it's really important to remember that this is a super dynamic situation. Like, things are constantly changing in the world of global trade, so we need to be flexible and adaptable.
So basically, we need to be ready to adjust our thinking and our spending habits as new information comes out.
You got it. It's all about being proactive and staying informed.
This conversation has really opened my eyes to how interconnected all of this stuff really is. It's not just about economics, it's about politics, it's about social responsibility, it's even about our own personal choices as consumers.
Couldn't agree more. It's definitely a complex web, but it's one that we all play a part in shaping.
And we are back for the final part of our deep dive into tariffs. We've covered a lot of ground today. We started with guacamole, then we moved to smartphones, and then we even got into, the possibility of an all-out trade war.
It's been a wild ride for sure. And I think it's safe to say at this point that tariffs, well, they're complicated. There's no easy answers.
Yeah, definitely not a simple yes or no situation. But, I do feel like I have a much better grasp on, like, the different arguments on both sides now.
Good, that's the goal.
But, there's one thing that keeps kind of sticking with me.
What's that?
Well, we've talked a lot about the big picture stuff,
Yeah.
right? Economics, global trade, all those international relations, all that. But, like, what about the actual people, the ones whose lives are, like, directly impacted by all these decisions? We haven't talked much about them.
Oh, that's such an important point. You're absolutely right. We can't forget about that human side of the story.
Exactly. It's so easy to get caught up in the numbers and all the, like, abstract economic theories and stuff. But behind all of that, there are real people, real stories.
Right. You think about, like, the American factory worker who loses their job because their company just can't compete with all those cheaper imports coming in.
Hmm.
Or, the Mexican farmer who can't export their crops anymore because of tariffs.
Yeah, those are the faces that we don't always see, when we're reading the headlines. But their stories are just as important as all that, like, economic data.
I agree 100%. Trade policies, they have a ripple effect. They create winners and losers. And I think it's just crucial that we consider the impact on, like, all the parties that are involved.
It makes me think about all the choices that we make, as consumers. Like, if we know that certain products have these tariffs on them and those tariffs are, like, potentially hurting people, does that change how we shop? Should it?
That's a really great question, and one that everyone should consider. I think a lot of times we probably have more power than we realize. Our everyday choices, they can send a message to these big companies and to policymakers.
So, like, if we're really concerned about the impact of tariffs, we could choose to buy products from companies that are really committed to things like fair trade practices or, that source their materials from countries that aren't involved in these, like, trade disputes.
Exactly. And we can also push for policies that actually promote fair and equitable trade. Policies that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
That's a great point. Well, this has been a truly eye-opening conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about tariffs, but, like, global trade in general and,
Yeah.
even my own role as a consumer.
Me too. I mean, it's a topic that I think is often oversimplified. But as we've seen, it's super nuanced. There's so much complexity involved.
So to all of our listeners out there, I encourage you, keep learning, keep exploring this stuff. Don't just take our word for it. Go do your own research, ask questions, and form your own opinions.
And remember, the world of global trade, it's always changing. It's dynamic. So staying informed is absolutely key.
And don't be afraid to, speak up, share your thoughts, whether it's with your friends, your family, your elected officials. Your voice matters.
You got it. Let's all work together to create a fairer and more sustainable global trade system, one that benefits everyone.
Couldn't say it better myself. Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of tariffs. Thank you so much for joining us today. And remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those brains buzzing.